My personal story is not entirely happy, but almost sad. Before we got married, we had a relationship for several years. Then one fine day she expressed her desire to explore other options, saying that maybe we could get back together later. That shocked me. Instead of facing my feelings, I buried myself in work. A year later, the person she chose over me betrayed her, leading to their breakup. She contacted me, but I decided not to respond. She got back together with him, and they were together for a while until he cheated again. This time they broke up completely, although she tried to reconnect. I rejected her again because her actions had hurt me deeply and I couldn't take that lightly. She moved on to another relationship, but unfortunately, that relationship turned abusive after about 6 months, leaving her traumatized. Unfortunately, I was at a party and got drunk and accidentally made up with her, but things were never the same again. Even though I still love her, I can't fully trust her again, and with good reason. Despite some hesitation, we dated for more than a year and finally decided to get married. She moved into my house, the house my grandparents gave me when I graduated from college. Although small and located on a dusty old road about 10 miles outside of town, it was perfect for me. We agreed to wait at least 3 years before starting a family. Our marriage seemed perfect for the first 2 years, and I believed everything was fine. Then history repeated itself. She left me and brought someone else into our relationship without my consent. That happened on Valentine's Day. After working half a day, I bought flowers and an ice cream card to surprise her. But when I got home, I saw a familiar car parked outside the door. The same car that her ex-boyfriend, the one she left me for, used to drive. I parked far away and approached cautiously. The main door was locked, so I took the spare key and hid it in the back and secretly entered the house through the kitchen. And I walked down the hall, heart pounding, only to hear them before I reached the living room. I heard them before I opened the door, with the creaks and groans. I opened the door enough to look inside and confirm it was my wife. Anything can happen, and I need to see it with my own eyes. And there she was under the blanket with Tom between her legs, the blanket swinging up and down as he thrust. My wife, a young beauty, is filled with love for others. I never thought about that. Hurt them. I want her out of my life. Seeing her give everything that belonged to me to someone else was truly painful. I have to crash the party. I walked in. Annie saw me first and covered her face with a blanket. Tom jumped out of bed and struggled to get dressed. I stood and watched silently. The whole room was quiet except for the sobbing under the blanket. When he was finished, he looked at me hoping I would move, but I remained standing at the door, even though he was bigger. Then I broke the silence and asked if he didn't forget anything, just looked around confused. Turning back to look at me, I glared at him as if saying, "You're stupid," then told him to take her, help her get up and change clothes, then leave here immediately. Annie started screaming, and by the time it was over, he had to drag her out of bed, force things against her, and drag her out of the house, her screams echoing. Tom had moved back into town with his parents, and over the next few days, I brought her things to his house as promised. During that time, he didn't say a word. Even though he was a famous man, he was very likable, unfortunately too likable for my wife. I saw him holding her tightly in the car as they left. Just as I promised, I threw all of her belongings that I found into Tom's yard. No one came out and I didn't knock on the door either. It was only a few days later that I learned that she refused to go to his house, but he took her to her parents' house, about 60 meters away. She called her home phone and my phone so continuously that I finally had to unplug my home phone and change the number. Not knowing what to say to her, a few days after leaving her things at Tom's house, her parents drove to her house. Annie was also in the car, but I told her dad that if she went out, we all had to go. He told her to stay where he could see, and she cried again. Then both parents came inside. First they apologized about her, but I said it wasn't their fault. Then they want to know what can be done to make things better, to help us get through this. Their reactions to their answers showed that it had never crossed their minds. I told them there was nothing they could do. Annie was broken and I didn't want her back in my life. She cheated on me in her bed and we were over. I said it all in a calm but firm voice, leaving no room for argument. Then I told them everything from when we first started dating to how she had behaved before, surprising us both. Sue, Annie's mother, tried to explain that Annie was very depressed, which made me want to snort. I told them she wasn't as devastated as I was. She just lost one person, and I lost a woman. It was planned to have children, raise them and grow old together, but the whole time, I cried and so did the other two. However, I told them that this was not something that needed to be done. Annie needs to move on and find someone else. I mentioned Tom's name, and that made Sue look at me with an annoyed look. Sue told me that Annie vowed never to look at Tom again is to consider him my man. Of course, I told them it was too late, because she chose Tom over me, and that was it. I promised to keep in touch with them by phone because they were worried about Annie and the way she was taking things. Seeing that, I just shook my head in disappointment and muttered about how difficult this was for her. I think the next week, George, Annie's father, called and asked if I would talk to Annie, but I said no. Looks like she hasn't eaten anything since I kicked her out, or at least very little. She's not a big girl, and with her skinny body, she doesn't have much weight left to lose. George and Sue both begged me. There is one thing that sounds more heartbreaking than they do. It was their baby, and they were worried that she might harm herself. I gave her the papers the following week. We each took out of the marriage what we brought into it, which was really very little. But I offered to split half of our savings, which was substantial between the two kids, almost $30,000 from before we got married. When George called me again, he was sobbing like Annie had cried when Tom pulled her out of my house. He asked if I could pause so we both had a chance to calm down. He said Sue and Annie were both in further shock, and Annie started vomiting as soon as she was served the food, and still hasn't eaten anything. They eventually called an ambulance, and she was taken to the hospital. After we hung up, I left the city. I just left, quit my job, handed over management to my parents so they could decide everything for me, and also rented the house. Then I went, my first year in Alaska working on a fishing boat. At that time, I did not contact anyone. My second year, I worked on another fishing boat in California, catching tuna. The next 3 years I spent in Alaska, working at Prudhoe Bay in the oil fields. For 5 years, I didn't spend money on anything. All the money I earned was in the bank. I made a large amount of money, even larger through wise investments, which my old boss made possible for all of us. It's not that I'm rich, but I have enough money to retire, just need to take out a small amount every year. If I lived on $50,000 per year, I'm still increasing my investments, not dissipating them all. I also have partial shares in several oil wells, 3 natural gas wells, and half of a small tuna fishing fleet. The annual income from oil wells is also okay. We had an accident at Prudhoe that made me think about life and death, and I finally decided to quit my job and return to my hometown. My family was surprised to see me appear at their door one evening. Our conversations weren't many. I didn't want to dwell on what I'd lost, but returning home was wonderful. And then, that morning, they called all their families and a big party was planned for the next afternoon, on Saturday. They updated me about Annie. After I left, she was hospitalized for a long time because she refused to eat and finally committed suicide by cutting her hand. After a few tests, they discovered the reason was that she was pregnant. George and Sue contacted his family, hoping to contact him to announce that he was about to become a father. They tried wisely to patch things up, but after knowing the information, my father was unable to contact them. Contacted me, I was out of town, asked George as politely as possible about a grandparent DNA test. George happily agreed. After the baby was born, when everything was safe, they did a test and the results showed that I was not the father. George and Sue almost stopped reacting to the results. I also found out that I was divorced, but he refused to accept half of the money, and it was still in the bank. After the baby was born, he had a full head of black hair exactly like Tom. Finally, he stood up and married Annie. When they found out he was the father, they were married for nearly 4 years and had 2 more children. They live in his house, and he makes a steady living. Annie stayed home to take care of the children, and the few times my parents saw her, she seemed quite happy. At the party, I was surprised to see George and Sue stop by. They were invited by my parents and wanted to meet me. I had a nice chat with them both. They said Annie was happy with the kids but not so happy with Tom, because he kept sneaking out. He couldn't control himself. She's wearing pants and has brought home a few surprises for herself, Sounds like she won't leave Tom for it, like I told her family. She's damaged goods, and who will take her? They were all happy to hear everything was going well, although I didn't tell them that by our standards I was well off. Not rich, just okay. They were sad and both admitted they wished they were still my family. I saw Annie one day when I was sitting at a local restaurant, eating a sandwich and drinking water while working online. She has 3 kids. The kids with her looked at me in shock when I raised my head and we faced each other. I'm not angry anymore. I've let it go. She approached me, like a deer about to run, and when I didn't react, she sat in the seat I offered. We had a good talk, but when she tried to explain and apologize, I said no. I didn't want to hear it. She tried a few more times until I threatened to get up and leave. Afterwards, we had a delicious lunch that I bought for her. The kids were so cute, and the oldest boy sat on my lap. Then, when it was all over, there was a moment when she looked at Timmy sitting on my lap and started crying, telling me that he should have been my son and this should have been our life together. I just smiled and told her that I had always dreamed like that too. Hearing me say that, she stood up, grabbed the kids and the diaper and almost ran out the door. Interestingly, a year later, I got married. Who am I marrying? It's the tenant who lives in my house. My parents told me to come over and talk to her about moving, and we had a little connection. In the end, I left her there. She was a college student, and we lowered the rent enough for her to pay. She didn't really have anywhere else to go. We started dating, and after a few months, we knew it was true love. I didn't ask her to marry me. Maybe I should have, but I didn't. You see, Janie doesn't know that she's marrying a man of means. I'm not the richest person, but I'm not poor either. I have a stable job, and my finances are not bad. She thought she was just going from job to job around the country with nothing. There's nothing to brag about. In fact, after a few months of getting married, I still live at home with my parents. I haven't looked for a job yet. Finally, she came to ask me with a worried look. Not knowing if I was or you planning on finding a job? She's most worried that I'll work far away, leaving her home alone for a long time. I was really happy when I sat down and explained to her that I had saved some money. The plan is that we can live on that money, of course. She was worried about what we would do when we ran out of money, while she was still teaching. She has her certification but hasn't found a job recently. All the jobs she's found have required a fairly long commute. The expression on her face was indescribable when I took a piece of paper, wrote an amount of money on it, and turned it upside down. She hadn't seen the number yet and asked me what I was doing. After I told her how much money was in my bank account and thought it might help us for a while, she hesitantly asked if she could see it. I pretended to be worried and slowly gave it to her, and she slowly turned it over. She looked up at me with surprise, very happy to know I had a decent amount of money in my account. Even though her house is small, at least we don't have to pay rent. Even though I still don't have a car or truck, her small car is paid off. We went out to celebrate. The worry on her shoulders seemed to be lifted. A week later, she was waiting for me when I returned from the backyard. After calling me, she checked my account and told me to contact the bank because I made a mistake depositing money into our account. When I smiled, she looked bewildered. When I told her it was an automatic deposit because it was the first day of the month, she became even more confused. She left and went for a walk, saying she needed some time alone. When she came back, I was in the garden and sat down. She looked at me for a moment, and I finally sat back and looked at her closely. I could see that she was still in shock. That evening, we went to dinner. We had just sat down when I saw Tom, Annie, and the children across the room all saw us. I don't know if they know I'm married or not. This was the first time I went out with Janie and saw both of them. Janie looked when I mentioned them, but that was it. She already knew who my ex was from the pictures and knew the story, but this was the first time she had seen Annie and had a clear name. Our town is not big, but neither of us likes to go out, usually preferring to be alone. Before the food arrived, she stood up and asked permission to go to the bathroom. It wasn't until the food arrived that I realized Annie wasn't sitting with the family. That makes me worried. Jan won't do anything, but maybe she wants to see her ex. Janie didn't say anything but looked a little smug as she turned around. I glanced over and saw Annie sitting down with her family, looking like she had been crying. Within minutes, they had paid the bill and Tom gave me an annoyed look as they passed. Tears were still streaming down Annie's face as she passed. Janie wouldn't admit it, but she saw Annie go to the bathroom and couldn't resist following her to chat. While talking, Janie suggests that Annie will regret what she let go of. What happened next in the conversation is not revealed, but I don't want to know. Annie represents my past, and Janie represents the future. In the years that followed, our family expanded with the birth of two wonderful children, a boy and a girl, while we lived there. Living in the same house, Janie still maintains her routine with a familiar car and a job at the local high school. Our life was very fulfilling, despite only having a modest Chevy pickup. We find satisfaction and peace in life. Even in summer, we still like to stay comfortably at home. We laugh at the little things. As for Annie and Tom, suffice it to say that the best revenge is to live a fulfilling life. Thank you for listening. Don't forget to share, like, and subscribe to hear more stories like this. Wishing you good health.